Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to be doing my September and my October reading wrap up, and I am so excited to talk about all of these books. A lot of them are in reading vlogs, and so if you guys want a more thorough review of all of the books that I read in the last 2 months, I'll link all the reading vlogs down below, but we're still going to get into it today. So before we jump into all of the books, I want to start off with a few stats. So overall, in the months of September and October, I read 11 books. I read 5 romances, I read 4 classics, 1 nonfiction, and 1 sci-fi. So we kind of had an emphasis on 2 genres in the last 2 months, but I feel like overall there was a good mix. I was surprised though, I didn't realize that I didn't read any fantasy. Very out of character for me, but I think that's going to change in November. And then lastly, I wanted to talk to you guys about my TBRs. How did I do on them? And for my September TBR, I am so proud to say that I read 5 out of 5 books on my September TBR. Feels so good every single time. And then for my October TBR, I have also almost read 5 out of 5, and I'm so happy. The only reason I can't fully check this off, 2 reasons actually. The first, I'm in the middle of my last book number 5 on the October TBR, that book being The Atlas 6. But since I'm reading it right now, I'm not really counting it as a TBR because it's off the TBR. It's currently being read. So to me, this counts, even though I technically won't finish it until November. So if you guys want to see a review of this book, stick around for my November wrap up. And the only other little caveat is instead of reading the second book in the X-Hex trilogy, I ended up reading the first book instead. So I kind of switched it out, but I still wanted to count it because it's part of the same series. But all of that said, I am very, very happy that I read essentially 10 out of 10 books on my September and October TBR. So you guys know that when I choose my TBRs, they're so for real. I try to stick to them as best as I can, but I have been yapping about stats. Let's talk about books. About half of the books that I read in the last 2 months I do own physically, but the other half of them I either read on Kindle or I got them from my library. And the first book that I read in the month of September is The Ultimate Guide to Planning Your Personal Finances by Mike Bernstein. This is the nonfiction book that I read over the last 2 months. I don't write nonfiction, the same goes for classics, but just know that I did really enjoy this book. I wouldn't recommend this book to getting into personal finance. I feel like there are a lot of other books that's probably a better place to start. I think also this book, there were a lot of discussions about things that tend to, I guess the best way to say it is older people than me probably are dealing with some of the things that this book talks about. For instance, whether or not you should put money into your retirement or pay for your kids' college. And so if you're a little bit older than me, if you have kids, if you feel like you're a good way into your personal finance journey already, then I would highly recommend this book. Overall, I really enjoyed it, and I feel like it gives me a good outlook on things that I'm going to have to be more aware of in the future, if that makes sense, but I didn't necessarily relate to some of the things at this point in my life. Then the next book that I read is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This was my second book by George Orwell. I read this in my classics reading vlog, and I really enjoyed this book. I know it's not always the case. Not everyone enjoys George Orwell's books. I definitely have a few friends that are not the biggest fan. We start out with our lazy, drunk farmer, and he forgets to feed the animals on his farm. And it ultimately results in the animals having a full-blown rebellion against the farmer. They take over the farm and they decide they're going to run it how they want to run it. They're going to have their own set of rules, their own set of ideals, and we go from there. All of the animals are incredibly anthropomorphized. There's a lot of political commentary that goes on in this book that's very emblematic of the time that it was written. And generally, I really enjoyed this book. If you're looking for a shorter, quicker classic to get into, I feel like this is a good place to start. It's not super long, it's not super intimidating. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book. It wasn't my favorite classic of all time, time. And I can honestly say I don't think about it too much now that I've finished it. But again, I did enjoy it. I do recommend it, and I'm really glad that I've now read it. Then next we have another classic. The next book that I read in September is The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I really enjoyed this book. I honestly didn't really know very much about this going into it. In fact, this book wasn't even on my radar for like a very long time. It was gifted to me, and I feel like the moment that somebody gifts me a book, I feel this sense of urgency to read it and report back to them. I don't know why that is. You might notice a theme in some of these books being gifted to me and me reading them like immediately. And so because again, it was a gift, I didn't really know anything about it. Since reading it, I can now tell you that in this book, we are following our main character. Her name is Lily Bart, and it takes place in the early 1900s in New York. And we're really looking at this New York aristocracy, the socialites. And at the beginning, we're following Lily Bart as she's realizing that the key to success, the key to making it in life and achieving all of her personal goals is finding a wealthy husband. Yeah. Words of Lily Bart. And in a lot of ways, we watch how this social pressure really leads to the unraveling of Lily Bart. And that is all that I will say about that. It's definitely a classic that I have continued to think about. I'm really glad that I read it. Also, in terms of accessibility, it's not the easiest classic to read, but I also didn't think it was the hardest. So maybe somewhere in the middle, if that's helpful to anybody. Okay, that's the last thing that I have to say about this one. I know that was a lot of like personal finance, classic, but I did reach my wit's end, and I had to mix it up with something light and fun. The next book that I read was Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez, and I am so glad that I read this book. 5 stars. I'm not even telling you what it's about yet. I'm starting with the fact that I rated this 5 stars, and if you guys know me, then you know that I don't give those out lightly. Also, this is an instance where I literally had to stray away from my TBR because I just needed something else to mix things up, and I felt like September was sort of the last reasonable month of the year for me to read this. Like, I didn't want to have to pick this up in October, November, December. It wasn't the vibe, but I really wanted to read this. And if you're unfamiliar with this series, you've probably seen this book before, but it's actually the 3rd book in an interconnected standalone series. And so you can read this romance book on its own, but I strongly advise against it. I wanted to pick this book up earlier in the year, but I had a lot of people telling me to read the first 2 books and then go into this one. The first book is Part of Your World, and the second one is Yours Truly. Both fantastic books, by the way. And I'm so glad that everyone told me to read these books in that order, because I will say this book really hits home in a different way if you've read everything in order. There's a lot of aha moments, a lot of like, oh my gosh, that's how everything's connected. And it just resonated again so deeply because you knew this backstory and this history. It felt like when I was reading it, I was coming home to something I was already so familiar with. Do with that what you will, but I really recommend reading this in the proper order. All of that aside, this book follows our 2 main characters, Justin and Emma, and Justin writes this Reddit thread. He goes viral on Reddit because he basically says, hey, I have this curse thing, or whatever you want to call it, that every time I date someone and we break up, the next person that my ex dates goes off and finds their one true love, the person that they marry, and he's sick of it. And he's like, I don't know why this keeps happening to me. And so our main character, or I guess our other main character, Emma, she sees this viral Reddit thread. She's like, holy crap, me too. Every time she dates someone, that person goes off and finds the love of their life after Emma and said guy break up. So she DMs Justin. She's like, hey, King, we're both cursed. What if we date each other, break up, and then theoretically the next person that they date will be the one? What could go wrong, right? The last thing that I will say about this book is it looks, like I said, light, fun, happy, summery. And while it has those vibes, there's also a lot of depth here. Prepare to cry, prepare to be sad. All of that is in here and more. And yeah, I could go on about this for so long. 5 stars. I loved this book. Then next we had the one sci-fi book that I read in September, and that book is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This book has been so hyped up on the internet. I feel like I saw Haley Pham read this book and become obsessed with it, and then I saw so many other people become obsessed with this series. And I know that it's been around for a long time, but I don't know, for some reason I just hadn't been drawn to it. Don't get me wrong, I love sci-fi. I think sci-fi is such a great genre. I've read Dune, I've read The Three Body Problem, I've read a fair amount of sci-fi. Those are just some bigger titles, I feel like. And so when this one got onto my radar, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna read it, do it, and see what I think about it. And it was good, but I wasn't as impressed as I think I was hoping to be. In this book, we're following our main character whose name is Darrow, and the book takes place on Mars far into the future. And it's casts that everyone has a different color depending on where in society you are. And so Darrow is a red, and the reds are at the bottom of society. However, Darrow, among the other Reds, are working so hard because they have been told that the work that they're doing is in hopes of making the planet Mars more hospitable so people in the future can come and live there and have a better life than they do. And the book goes from there. Let's just say there's a lot of lies, a lot of action, a lot of betrayal. And ultimately, it somehow becomes, people say this all the time, but honestly, it's the best way to describe it. It becomes the Hunger Games on Mars. And it's not a bit, it's quite violent, very, very violent, and a little bit graphic in certain ways. And if you're not super into that, like action-packed, violent stuff, also extremely political, and I can only imagine that this is going to get more political as the series progresses. I don't know if I would recommend it. I rated this book like I don't know what I rated it initially. I think I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5, and I don't know if I want to continue the series. So if you guys have any thoughts for or against that, let me know in the comment section down below, because I don't know what to do. All right, besties. Now that was September. Now we are entering into October. And the first book that I finished in October, you guys are going to be so happy about this because y'all have been begging me in the comment section down below to read this. And that book is none other than Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. And this is a book that I feel like I have seen my absolute favorite booktubers just love so much. But the nature of the plot and the story and everything that I've heard about it, I wasn't really sure if it was the kind of thing that I would be obsessed with. Without saying too much, this book follows extremely wealthy London socialites. More specifically, we're looking at our 2 main characters, Magnolia and BJ, who are hopelessly in love with each other, but in order to protect themselves and recover from the ways that they've hurt each other in the past, they just, keep screwing each other over. And I feel like this whole book circles around this idea of how do you rationalize these 2 conflicting ideas and feelings. When the person that you love is the person that's hurt you, how do you make sense of that? I don't know. They don't know, okay? And overall, I like this book, and I'm so glad that I did. This book is so polarized. Some people love it, some people hate it. I decided to give it a 4-star. It wasn't my favorite thing I've ever read on the planet. I will say, I keep thinking about this book all throughout this month. I keep wondering what happened next, and I haven't continued the series because I don't own the series. It is not available at my library. It did not get picked in my November TBR, and I'm gonna have to squeeze it in somewhere because I'm dying to know what happens next. But I can't even read the next one in the series. I have to read the Daisy Hates books next. I won't yap on too long about this. I liked it. It was good. Just don't go into it thinking that this is what you should model your romantic relationships after, because that is horrible advice. Don't do it. It's toxic, but very entertaining. So as we are now in the month of October with these books, things start to get very spooky very quickly, and I am so glad that they do. The next book that I read in the month of October was The Ex-Hex by Erin Sterling. This was actually my first and only reread, I think, that's going to be in this wrap up. I read The Ex-Hex, I want to say 3 or 4-ish years ago. I think I read it close to when it came out. I enjoyed it the first time, not so much for the romance, mostly for the spooky fall Halloween vibes. The first time that I read this book, I gave it a 3-star. I always think back on how much I loved the Halloween Town and Gilmore Girl energy, and it did such a good job putting me in the spooky spirit the first time that I read it. So this time I was like, oh my gosh, I just want those Halloween Town feelings again. So I decided to reread it this year. Like I said, I technically put the second book on my TBR, but I felt like it was a bit interchangeable since it's, it's all the same series, again, interconnected standalones. And again, it was good the second time around. I'm giving it a 3-star again. I think this time I got my spooky fill before the book ended. I honestly don't like the romance. I don't like the characters. The writing is okay. It's not my favorite. It's purely the setting and the vibes that I was there for. And so after I felt in the Halloween spirit, I was kind of ready for it to be over. But if you're looking for spooky vibes and just good fall energy, I would recommend this book. I mean, clearly, I reread it, so it can't be that bad. It's very witchy. I know I've told you nothing about the plot. There's witches, there's a romance, and that's pretty much all you need to know. The next book that I read in the month of October was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, and I loved this book. I was not really planning super seriously on reading this book in October leading up to it, but it ended up getting chosen in my TBR wheel, and you guys know me. What the TBR says, I must do. It's the law around here. I do my very best, and I am so glad that I read this book. In this story, we're following a witch named Mika. It's kind of hard to explain, but in the world, I guess that you would say that this book is set in, witches attract magic to them. And so when there's more magic in one place, it's more dangerous, more catastrophic things can happen. So it's very uncommon for witches to gather together. Hello everyone, it is Editing Olivia here, and in this part of the video, basically my camera stopped recording. The part of the video that got lost basically said that witches in this world attract magic to each other, and Mika, our main character, gets this opportunity, I guess you would call it, to go and tutor these young witches, but she's very confused because witches aren't supposed to gather together. And so she goes to this house to tutor these young orphaned witches, and she ends up building a relationship with them. And then also during this story, she meets someone at the house, and that's where the romantic relationship comes into place. Okay, now we're gonna go back to the video. Sorry, y'all, my camera just stopped recording. I hope that doesn't happen again. But as I was saying, I was really invested in the girls and if they were gonna learn everything that they needed to learn. So when we switched over to the romance, I was like, I don't want the romance. It felt like there was no buildup. I didn't feel the connection. I didn't feel any of the tension. I just wanted to know how the girls were doing. So I felt like we kind of forgot about what I cared about. And so for that reason, I ended up giving this a 4-star, but it was cozy, entertaining. I was giggling. I loved this book. I would highly recommend. I know it's not October anymore, but I feel like this would still hit in November. So if you're considering picking up this book, I say do it. The next book that I read in October is my favorite book that I read in October by a landslide, and that book was Dracula by Bram Stoker. This was in my Reading Spooky Classics video. It actually, on the day that I'm filming this, that video went up today. It is currently Halloween when I'm filming this. Happy Halloween, but this video won't be going up for a little while, which you know because you're watching it anyway. But spoiler, I loved this classic so much. It might be like competing for top spot, like favorite classic. Basically, this book is what popularized vampires in the way that we know them today. And the story follows our main protagonist. His name is Jonathan Harker. He's a businessman, and he takes this business trip to Transylvania to help Count Dracula buy property in London. That's like what he does. It's real estate, it's a professional business deal. But we know, you and I, we know that Dracula is a freaking vampire. Jonathan has no idea. Poor Jonathan. He has no clue. He goes on this trip and he gets to the Hotel Transylvania, and it's creepy and spooky and gothic, and he starts picking up on all these quirks that Dracula has, and you can kind of picture where it goes from there. But what I didn't know so much about this original story, but we ultimately get to follow this whole big cast of characters. The writing is so good. I loved this book. I told you guys, I don't rate classics, but if I did, this would be like a 5-star classic. I loved it so much. I felt like it was so accessible. It was creepy, but so good. Oh, I could talk about it for so long. I loved it, and I definitely want to read this book again in the future. It was so good. Please go read it right now, yesterday, tomorrow. Just do it. So we're going from a high to a bit of a low. Actually, what we're doing is going from the highest high to the lowest low. And the next book that I read was The Pumpkin Spice Cafe by Lori Gilmore. I'll just cut to the chase. I didn't like this book. I didn't like it at all. But what I do love is the cover. Can we just take a moment for that gorgeous cover? We have this beautiful foiling. The read was not a success, but the cover is a success, and I don't really know what more a girl could want. I love fall. I love Halloween. I love Gilmore Girls. I love pumpkin spice. I was like, I've got to read it. I've got to give this book a shot. And in this book, we're following our main character. Her name is Jeannie, and her aunt gifts her the Pumpkin Spice Cafe. And Jeannie, at the time, she's like working a high-stress job in Boston. She's like, I am out of here. I'm gonna go be a cute cafe owner in this small town of Dream Harbor and serve pumpkin spice coffees to everybody. And I feel like in theory, this is really cute. Our love interest, his name is Logan. He's very grumpy. He's also, I said this in my reading vlog, he's very Luke-coded if you've seen Gilmore Girls. And you know, beyond that, like it sounds really great, but I think my biggest gripe with this novel was the dialogue. Everything that the characters were saying felt very forced. It didn't feel like the conversations flowed very logically, like the plot flowed very logically. I think overall, just the writing and the dialogue really bothered me. And when you can't get past the dialogue, how do you enjoy the book? That is the thing that really bugged me. And so as I got further into it, I kind of just started skimming more and more and more, but I didn't like it. I gave it a 2-star. With that said though, if the writing doesn't bother you, I feel like a lot of people could like this book. So I'm not recommending it. Do with that what you will. I didn't like this book, but maybe you will. Maybe you did, and that's fine. Okay, y'all, the last book that I read in October, again, barring my current read, because as I'm filming this, we're in October, was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And so I read this one, and again, I enjoyed it, but not quite as much as I've enjoyed other classics, if that makes sense. In this book, we're following our main character. His name is Victor Frankenstein, and he is essentially like a scientist. Seems like the best broad strokes way to describe him. We start out the book and he is really, really obsessed with science. He clearly has a passion for biology and chemistry, and that kind of transforms into an obsession with life. And how do we bestow life upon things? What is the source of life? How do we give life to the undead? Not the undead, the no longer living, the dead. Yeah, this is not a spoiler. You guys know the story of Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is able to bring this thing back to life and creates this now undead monster. And I really enjoyed looking at, there's so much to talk about in this book. Again, watch the reading vlog if you're curious, but there were a lot of discussions on, whether evil is born or if it's made. There was a bit of a villain origin story in here. There was a lot of character commentary, comparisons to be made between Frankenstein and his monster. And I really enjoyed this book. I will say I enjoyed it more and more as we got further into it. So if you start this book and aren't feeling super emotionally attached, aren't super into it, that's fine. I probably didn't like this book until, not didn't like it, but I didn't really care that much about anything until about the 30% mark. That was a lot of chatting, but I love doing these videos. I try to combine 2 months of reading for these videos rather than doing it every month, because I mean, I read as much as I can, but like a lot of other people read, you know, more books than me. So those were all of the books that I was able to read in the months of September and October. I want to know, you guys definitely let me know, what was your favorite book that you have read? It could be in the last 2 months or honestly just recently. Tell me so I can add it to the TBR wheel for, gosh, for December. Crazy, crazy, crazy. I would love to know what some of your guys' favorite books have been. And lastly, if you guys made it all the way to the end, comment down below the star emoji so I know who the real ones are. I am so grateful for each and every one of you. You guys have no idea. I've had so much fun working on this YouTube channel this year. And I think that's it from me. I hope you guys are having a great day and a great reading month, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.